Greg Bahnsen asks, what justification has the autonomous man for assuming the law of non-contradiction? The independent thinker is quick to respond that the critic himself must assume the law of non-contradiction in order to argue against him, but it does not follow from this fact that logic is its own foundation. Moreover, for the autonomous man to appeal to the law of non-contradiction in order to support his use of the law is to reason in a vicious circle. What Bahnsen draws out here is the age-old problem of justifying one's belief in the laws of logic. What argument could be offered on their behalf? And how would any argument for the truth of logical laws not fall prey to vicious circularity, since all arguments depend on the validity of logical laws? This is what is known as the logocentric predicament. Paul Boghossian states the predicament succinctly. Since logic will inevitably be involved in any account of how we might be justified in believing it, how is it possible for us to be justified in our fundamental logical beliefs? Susan Haack presents the predicament as a syllogism. All justification is either non-deductive or deductive. On the one hand, a non-deductive justification is too weak, and on the other hand, a deductive justification of deduction is circular. Therefore, deduction cannot be justified. The traditional argument for the justification of logical laws has its roots in Aristotle. He offered a transcendental argument for the law of non-contradiction, according to which any attempt to deny the law of non-contradiction would assume its truth. To say that the law of non-contradiction is not true is itself a non-contradictory statement. Thus, the denial of the law of non-contradiction assumes it, and as such the objection is self-refuting. It would be safe to say that this remains the most common argument offered in support of logical laws. This method does, however, have three distinct drawbacks. First of all, it is transcendental. It establishes that one cannot deny the laws of logic. However, it does not follow from this that our beliefs about the laws of logic are true. Bahnsen himself makes this point, saying, strictly speaking, this is only an indication that we are bound to think in certain patterns. This does not tell us anything about the truthfulness or appropriateness of those patterns. Perhaps we are locked into a distorted mindset. Second, this argument is circular. All that it serves to establish is that the skeptic of logic contradicts himself by denying it. But that is only a problem if the law of non-contradiction is true in the first place. Yet this was what the argument was purported to prove. Therefore, showing that denial of the law of non-contradiction is contradictory only demonstrates the validity of the law to those who are already convinced of its truth. Once again, Bahnsen's comments are correct. For the autonomous man to appeal to the law of non-contradiction to support his use of that law is to reason in a vicious circle. He proves his conclusion by appealing to his conclusion. This is illegitimate for him elsewhere, so it must be prohibited here. Third, this argument is forceless against dialetheism. Dialetheism holds that some contradictions are true, but not all. Aristotle's argument, if it works at all, would only work against the person who claims that all contradictions are true. But by making a simple distinction between some contradictions and all contradictions, the dialetheist easily escapes the conclusion of the argument. As Graham Priest says, the most obvious failing of this argument is that it makes the familiar and illicit slide from some to all. The mere fact that some contradictions are rationally acceptable does not entail that all are. The charge, you accept some contradictions to be true, so why shouldn't you believe any contradiction to be so, is as silly as the charge, you believe something to be true, so why shouldn't you believe anything to be so. Likewise, Panayot Butchvarov says, it is a mistake to suppose that if the principle of non-contradiction were false, then language, thought, and argument would be impossible. To deny that no propositions are both true and false is to assert not that all propositions are true and false, but that some propositions are both true and false. These shortcomings in the traditional argument have created something of a pessimism among many philosophers about the possibility of ever justifying our most basic logical beliefs. It would be an understatement to say that the general attitude towards the logocentric predicament in contemporary philosophy is that there is no non-circular solution to the problem. For example, Michael Dummett says, it is of little use to argue for the possibility of justifying logical laws without circularity. Hartry states that all arguments for genuine soundness are circular in this way is widely acknowledged. Robert Hanna is the most explicit, saying, The epistemic circularity of logic entails both that logic is inexplicable and unjustified. The circularity of logic is a vicious circularity, or more starkly put, logic is groundless. We know immediately that if non-circular justification for logic is intended to consist of an argument, then we are at a dead end. Because arguments necessarily depend on logic, the demand would be that we give an argument without giving an argument. This is an obvious impossibility. But what is the alternative? Are we simply constrained to blindly follow logical laws and hope that they are true? I am convinced that there is a better way. In the previous section, I introduced the idea of immediate justification. That is, beliefs that are justified without mediation, but are known by virtue of one's direct acquaintance with their truth makers, as well as their correspondence with the beliefs. I argued that this was the only way to stop the regress problem, and it seems to me that this is also the solution to the problem of deduction. My strategy here is known as metafoundationalism. It depends on the possibility of a priori knowledge, specifically the concept of analyticity. Briefly, a priori knowledge is knowledge gained apart from experience. Analytic a priori knowledge is understood to be a priori propositions that are true solely in virtue of the meanings of the concepts involved. Cory, Juhl, and Loomis explain, analyticity has been taken to be a property of sentences, propositions, judgments, or statements. In contemporary use, a sentence or statement is analytic if and only if it is true solely in virtue of the meanings of its constituent terms. A common example of an analytic proposition is the sentence, "All bachelors are unmarried men." The sentence is true based on the meaning of the word bachelor and its correspondence to the meanings of the word unmarried and men. The truth bearer is the sentence itself, and the truth maker is the meaning of the words. Gillian Russell says, consider the proposition expressed by the following sentence. All bachelors are men. There seems to be a special kind of justification in the case of this proposition, which is not available in the case of the proposition 7.2. All bachelors are frustrated. In order to figure out if all bachelors are frustrated, I need to go out and examine the world, paying close attention to the bachelors and signs of frustration. In the case of the proposition that all bachelors are men, I need only realize that in order to count as a bachelor, you have to be a man. Boghossian concurs, saying, certain sentences are such that if someone knows the relevant facts about their meaning, then the person will be in a position to form a justified belief about their truth. This account explains how an analytic sentence is true easily enough, but the key difficulty facing any theory of analyticity is not so much to explain how an analytic proposition can be true, as it is to explain exactly how it is that such a proposition is justified. What is it that justifies our belief that a bachelor is an unmarried man, even if this belief is true? My proposal is that the justification lies in one's direct acquaintance with the relevant concepts. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew point out, one's knowledge of one's own concepts need not be mediated. There need not be any fallible steps by which one undertakes to determine what those concepts are. Because we can know our concepts directly, we can also be directly acquainted with at least some of the relations between and among them. When we hold the related concepts clearly in thought at the same time, we have a priori justification for believing an analytic truth P when we see, by acquaintance with the relevant conceptual relations, that there is no alternative but for P to be true. For example, most of us understand the concept of a Pegasus. We understand it to be a winged horse, even though there is no object to which this concept corresponds in reality. It is still true that we are acquainted with the concept. Hence the statement, a Pegasus is a winged horse, is analytic. It is true in virtue of what it means. Notice that it is true even though there is nothing to which the statement corresponds in reality. It is justified by direct acquaintance with the concept of a Pegasus. This example serves to show how we can be directly acquainted with a concept. Although the fact that the statement, a Pegasus is a winged horse, is true may seem trivial, I want to argue that the same justification which we have for believing this statement, we also have for believing the laws of logic. We can be justified in our basic logical beliefs based on our direct acquaintance with the concepts involved. As Arthur Sullivan says, our justification for logical truths is grounded in our understanding their constituent concepts. Consider the law of non-contradiction. It states that contradictory propositions cannot be true at the same time and in the same sense. Now let's analyze the concept of a contradiction. A contradiction is a combination of two or more statements, ideas, or beliefs that negate one another. Contradictions arise when a claim purports to be true and it is incompatible with another existing truth claim. An essential concept contained within the idea of a contradiction is incompatibility. If two propositions can both obtain, then they are not incompatible. Hence, no contradictions can obtain. If two beliefs that were thought to be contradictory did obtain, this would demonstrate that they were in fact compatible, and this in turn would show that they are not incompatible and therefore not contradictory. As Jonas Arenhart succinctly says, once contradictory or incompatible concepts are granted to obtain together, there is no longer any reason to claim that they were incompatible to begin with. Again, all of this is justified by direct acquaintance with the concept of a contradiction. Now notice that just as the analysis of the Pegasus did not require that there actually be a Pegasus in order to be true, neither does this analysis of contradictions require that there actually be any contradictions in order to be true. The law of non-contradiction is true solely in virtue of what it means. The McGrews observe, if we are trying to explain the phenomenon of logics that purport to be serious rivals to classical logic, we can do so by seeing that such logics, if they have any value whatsoever, involve changes in meaning for the propositions allegedly denied in the alternative systems. Even Bahnsen will have to grant that one needs a conceptual grasp of logical laws in order to understand his question. But if my suggestion is correct, then nothing more than an understanding of the concepts is needed to answer his argument. C.I. Lewis concludes, the analytic truth of logical principles justifying such modes of valid inferences similarly is certifiable by understanding the meaning of the formal statement which expresses the principle in question, and it is not determinable in any manner essentially different. It is not certifiable in any way which does not, at bottom, depend upon properties entailed by intentional meanings which are involved. So to summarize all of that, belief in the laws of logic can be justified a priori via analyticity. They are true because of what the terms involved mean. They are justified by our direct acquaintance with the relevant concepts. Because the justification is direct and is not mediated through arguments, the justification does not depend on an argument. As such, the justification does not assume the laws of logic. Therefore, logical laws can be justified in a non-circular way. Now perhaps it will be objected that this solution to the logocentric predicament is much too permissive. After all, can't anyone claim to have justification for any belief just by claiming that their belief is analytic? This is certainly a legitimate concern, but it doesn't really pose any challenge to the account I have proposed. People will frequently claim to see things that they have never really seen, or to have heard things that they have never really heard. The fact that some people abuse these avenues of knowledge does not mean that we cannot gain knowledge by means of visual and audible perceptions. The same point extends to a priori knowledge. The mere fact that someone can abuse this avenue does not in any way mean that those of us who have genuine a priori insights are any less justified. This observation serves to demonstrate the truly first-person nature of epistemology. An analytic proposition will be justified only for those who are actually acquainted with the relevant concepts and who actually understand the meanings of the terms involved. In a similar vein, the presuppositionalist is likely to object to any alleged analytic proposition by asking, by what standard? In other words, how do you know that you have direct acquaintance with the relevant concepts? But since according to this theory of analyticity, direct acquaintance is sufficient to justify a belief, the objection begs the question against it. Such an objection assumes that direct acquaintances stand in need of further justification. This is an assumption that we are entitled to reject. As Lawrence Bonjour argues, according to the moderate rationalist position, each alleged case of a priori justification should be construed as epistemically autonomous, as dependent on nothing beyond itself for its justification. Thus the present objection fails because the demand for meta-justification that underlies it turns out to simply beg the question of whether rational insight can constitute, as the rationalist claims, a genuine and autonomous basis for epistemic justification. So what does Bahnsen have to say about the proposal that belief in logic can be justified a priori? Unfortunately, he doesn't say much. He writes, if one's justification is a priori, then why should we think that repeated instances of logical truths will be experienced in a contingent world of history? And why do these a priori truths create insurmountable paradoxes? For example, the set of all sets which are not members of themselves. Bahnsen first asks why we should think that a priori knowledge is applicable to a contingent world. It is hard to see what Bahnsen's point here might be. He acts as though it is quite obvious that there is some reason why we wouldn't think that a priori knowledge would apply to a contingent world, but he doesn't make the point explicit. As such, I'm left to speculate. Perhaps Bahnsen means that since a priori knowledge is, by definition, independent of experience, we shouldn't expect it to apply to the world of experience. But that is a very strange conclusion to draw. Remember that my understanding of analyticity depends on concepts. Concepts are, for the most part, gained by experience. My concept of a bachelor, for example, is derived from my experience. If this concept is gained on the basis of a referent in the physical world, then it is instantiated in the physical world, and therefore the analytic truth that all bachelors are unmarried men applies to the actual world. Thus I can believe, with justification, that all bachelors are unmarried men without meeting every single bachelor. As long as the relevant concepts have reference in the physical world, the knowledge will apply to the physical world. As Paul Moser observes, analytic truths are true solely in virtue of non-extraneous interpretive commitments regarding their constituents. This holds even for truths of logic where analyticity does not entail synonymy as standardly understood. Analytic truths are true just in virtue of conceptual commitments, they are thus conceptually necessarily true. Moreover, we may grant that analytic truths do not always correspond to physical objects. Recall the proposition that a Pegasus is a winged horse. The proposition is analytic, but it does not have any referent in the actual world because the concept of a Pegasus is never instantiated. Yet the belief that a Pegasus is a winged horse is true. If a Pegasus did exist, it would be a winged horse. Similarly, there don't have to be any contradictions in the world in order for us to be able to know that all contradictions are false. If a contradiction did exist, it would be false. Thus, whenever we encounter contradictory claims, we can know with full assurance that at least one claim is false. The truth of analytic propositions is not contingent upon their constituent concepts obtaining in the physical world. They are true with or without physical reference. Crucially, when the concepts do have physical reference, analytic truths cannot fail to correspond to reality since there is no state of affairs that could make it the case that they are false. Second, Bahnsen asks why logic leads to paradoxes. He only offers Bertrand Russell's paradox of the sets as an example. Once again, it is not entirely clear what Bahnsen's point is here. Logical paradoxes exist regardless of how one thinks that logical beliefs are justified. So why does Bahnsen think that paradoxes provide a special challenge for an a priorist account of their justification? He doesn't tell us. Suffice to say that I dispute Bahnsen's assumption that logical paradoxes are insurmountable. I believe that logical paradoxes can be resolved. To fully explore this issue would take us well beyond the purview of this video, but I will offer a solution to the one paradox that Bahnsen regards as so significant, the paradox of the sets. To be honest, I'm a bit surprised that Bahnsen selected this particular paradox as his prime example. Paradoxes such as the liar's paradox, the lottery paradox, the paradox of the preface, or the paradox of the heap are much more difficult to resolve in my opinion. Nonetheless, because Bahnsen chose this paradox, it is the one with which I shall concern myself. So just what is the paradox of the sets? Well, it was once thought that for any well-defined predicate, there is a set which contains all and only those things to which the predicate applies. So, for example, it was thought that there was a set containing all things that are blue. However, this idea runs into a problem when we consider the predicate is not a member of itself, because the corresponding set would have to both include itself and not include itself. And since this is a contradiction, it follows that no such set can exist. Now, many philosophers have simply rejected the existence of sets altogether. As David Papineau points out, Russell's paradox shows that naive theory is too naive. In particular, it shows that naive set theory contradicts itself. Some philosophers take this to be further evidence against the reality of sets. Certainly, this is a perfectly reasonable possibility. There's no obvious reason to think that sets are anything other than collections of things that humans decide are alike. Alternatively, one can simply reject the assumption that every well-defined predicate has a corresponding set. Michael Huemer concludes the matter rather well. A putative set does not exist if it has an inconsistent definition. The set that has exactly 3 members and has exactly 2 members does not denote anything. Nor does the set that contains itself if and only if it does not do so. Nor for the same reason does the set that contains all and only the things that don't contain themselves. Far from what Bahnsen suggests, logical paradoxes are not insurmountable. They just require us to think a little bit harder about some things. But under no circumstances do logical paradoxes challenge the a priori account of justification for belief in logical laws that I have set forth. Now, it should go without saying that the account which I am proposing is controversial. There is much debate within contemporary philosophy about the viability of analyticity and indeed the very possibility of a priori knowledge. However, prima facie we have a cogent response to Bahnsen's challenge. Belief in the truth-preserving nature of deduction is justified by our direct acquaintance with the relevant concepts, their meanings, and their relationships to one another. It is well beyond the scope of this video to examine the contemporary debate in detail, but it is also unnecessary. Since this is intended to be a response to Bahnsen's arguments, and he raises no objections to analyticity, the response I have sketched will suffice for my purposes here. To summarize what we have covered so far, I have argued that knowledge of logic is a priori and immediately justified. This account avoids the charge of circularity, but at the cost of making knowledge of logic something knowable only to those who do indeed grasp it a priori. We saw that this raises the concern that any and every belief may be claimed to be justified in the same fashion, but we concluded that this concern does not serve to undermine my proposal. Rather, it serves to underscore the fact that epistemology is a first-person enterprise. Nonetheless, it will be helpful to sketch an indirect method by which one might justify their belief in the laws of logic that, perhaps, those who are skeptical of my a priori account will find more satisfactory. Earlier in this video, I introduced the thesis that perceptions are immediately justified by virtue of one's direct acquaintance with that which one perceives. It is possible, I think, to utilize these perceptions in support of the truth of logical laws. Consider that any perception that is given to me has certain properties. Among these are logical properties. For example, if it appears to me that I see a red car, then I am not appeared to as seeing the negation. My perception of the red car is non-contradictory. If I acquire a very large number of non-contradictory perceptions and acquire no perceptions that are exceptions, then I may justifiably infer that all perceptions will be non-contradictory. And if I believe that my perceptions accurately reflect reality to a large degree, I can then conclude that the best explanation for my uniform and repeated experience of non-contradictory facts is that there is a law of non-contradiction. Note also that this method allows that genuine contradictions may be discovered in the future, so it is falsifiable and therefore does not beg the question against the skeptic of logical laws. However, until that is done, this argument gives abductive justification for believing in the laws of logic. This strategy may initially seem vulnerable to an obvious objection. Is it not true that logical laws require justification before one can justifiably believe their perceptions? However, this objection is easily dismissed by recognizing the distinction I made earlier between some and all. It is not necessary that all contradictions be false in order for some to be true. Thus, one can recognize that their perceptions are given to them in a non-contradictory way without thereby assuming the truth of the law of non-contradiction. As such, perceptions may indeed be used to build an abductive argument for the truth of logical laws without resorting to circularity. As Cory observes, the view can moreover appeal to these general facts of logic as grounds for the validity of their particular instances. Crucial to the view is that this need not reflect a justificatory order. The general patterns need not come first in why I am justified in reasoning to 3 from 1 and 2, and of what it is for me to appreciate or know that 1 and 2 entail 3. The view can thus avoid both the pitfalls of rule following, the general and particular circularity threat, and of particularism, or skepticism about general patterns.